Book 25. Livy. 1. While these events were taking place in Africa and Spain, Hannibal spent the summer in the territory of the Salentini, where he hoped to take control of the city of Tarentum by means of treachery. During that time, some insignificant cities of the Salentini went over to him. But in the same period, in Bruttium, 2 of the 12 peoples who have defected to the Carthaginians the year before, namely the Consentini and the Toriani, returned to their allegiance to the Roman people. In fact, more would have returned had it not been for Titus Pomponius Veientanus, an officer of the allies. After a number of successful plundering expeditions in Bruttian territory, Veientanus had acquired the stature of a regularly appointed commander, and he had come up against Hanno with a makeshift army that he had raised. Large numbers of men, though they were really just an ill-organized assortment of peasants and slaves, were killed or taken prisoner. The least significant loss was the commander, who was one of the men taken prisoner. Veientanus was responsible for the foolhardy encounter on that particular occasion, and earlier, as a tax gatherer, he had been guilty of all manner of corrupt practices, and had swindled both the state and private companies, and cost them dear. The consul Sempronius fought many minor engagements in Lucania, none worth recording, and took a few insignificant Lucanian towns. The war dragged on, with success and failure, changing the mentality of people as much as it did their material circumstances, and the longer it did so, the more superstition, and mostly foreign superstition, permeated the citizen body. So much so, in fact, that it seemed that either human beings or the gods had undergone a sudden transformation. Roman ritual was falling into disuse, and not just in private and within the home, in public too, in the forum and on the Capitol. There were crowds of women whose sacrifices and prayers to the gods did not follow traditional practice. Priests and oracle mongers had taken possession of the minds of the public, and the numbers of such people were swollen by the rustic proletariat, who had been forced into the city by poverty and fear, from fields that long years of war had left untilled and insecure. There was also easy money to be gained from the superstition of others, through an occupation its practitioners conducted as though it were legitimate. At first there were angry comments made in private by reputable people. But then the matter also came to the notice of the senators and became the subject of official complaint. The aediles and triumviri capitals were severely criticized by the Senate for their failure to suppress these practices. But when these magistrates attempted to remove the crowd from the forum and dismantle their ceremonial apparatus, they were almost physically assaulted. The melees now seemed too great to be effectively checked by junior officials, and the city praetor Marcus Aemilius was given the task by the Senate of freeing the people of such superstitions. Aemilius read the senatorial decree aloud at an assembly of the people, and also issued an edict that anyone in possession of books or oracles, or prayer, formulae, or a documented procedure for sacrifice should bring all such records and literature to him before the 1st of April. He also forbade anyone to offer sacrifice in a public or sacred location, using any unfamiliar or foreign ritual. 2. There were a number of deaths in the state priesthood that year. Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, Pontifex Maximus, Gaius Papirius Maso, son of Gaius Pontiff Publius Furius Philus Augur, and Gaius Papirius Maso, son of Lucius. Decemvir for sacrifices. Marcus Cornelius Cathagus and Annius Servilius Capio were appointed pontiffs to replace Lentulus and Papirius, respectively. Lucius Quintius Flaminius was elected augur, and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus decemvir for sacrifices. The date of the consular elections was now approaching, but the consuls were focused on the war, and it was decided not to call them away from it. Instead, the consul, Tiberius Sempronius, appointed Gaius Claudius Cento dictator for the holding of the elections, and Cento appointed Quintus Fulvius Flaccus his master of horse. Just a personal note here. When they describe, for example, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus as, they give him a title as decemvir for sacrifices. Decemvir, I'm just noticing this word here, decemvir, spelt Decemvir. Now, why that strikes me as interesting is because, Decemvir kind of sounds like December, as in the month we have on our modern calendar. But here's the thing about V in this word, V. Well, if you were to ask me if there was a connection between the letters V and B, right away I would point to the Hebrew. This is just, in passing, something I've noticed here. I'm no expert, but V and B are represented by the same character in the Hebrew alphabet, which illustrates and demonstrates the idea that that same character in Hebrew can be switched back and forth to make a B sound or a V sound. And I wonder if there was any such element in the Latin language, because this is obviously written in the Latin. I would think, I don't know, I don't know, perhaps Livy wrote in the Greek. Maybe someone out there knows. I'm not sure myself, but I find that word, Decemvir, interesting. Decemvir. Simply switch out the B, and you have Decemvir. Put a B in, you have December. Anyway, moving on. Perhaps someone else out there knows about this. But anyway, the date of the consular elections was now approaching, but the consuls were focused on the war, and it was decided not to call them away from it. Instead, the consul Tiberius Sempronius appointed Gaius Claudius Cento dictator for the holding of the elections, and Cento appointed Quintus Fulvius Flaccus his master of horse. On the first available election day, the dictator returned as consuls his master of horse, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, and Appius Claudius Pulcher, who had had Sicily as his province during his praetorship. After that, the following praetors were elected: Gnaeus Fulvius Flaccus, Gaius Claudius Nero, Marcus Iunius Silanus, and Publius Cornelius Sulla. The elections completed, the dictator resigned his position. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the man who later bore the cognomen Africanus, was curule adal that year, with Marcus Cornelius Cethegus as his colleague. When Scipio stood for election to the aedileship, the plebeian tribunes attempted to block his candidacy, claiming that he had not have the right to stand because he was not yet of legal age to seek office. "If all the citizens of Rome want to make me an aedile," Scipio declared, "then I am old enough." After that, when the people divided into tribes for the vote, the support for Scipio was so strong that the tribunes promptly abandoned their efforts. The largesse of the aediles that year lay in the staging of the Roman games on what was, for the resources of the day, a lavish scale, and with a single day's repetition, the gifts of members of oil being made to each locality. The plebeian aediles, Lucius Villius Tapulus and Marcus Fundanius Fundulus, brought before the people charges of immoral conduct against a number of married women, and some were found guilty and sent into exile. The plebeian games were repeated for a period of 2 days, and there was a banquet for Jupiter in honor of the games. 3. Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and Appius Claudius now entered the consulship, Flaccus for the 3rd time. The praetorian sortition of duties was as follows: Publius Cornelius Sulla. Urban and foreigners' jurisdiction, formerly these had been separate portfolios. Gnaeus Fulvius Flaccus. Apulia. Gnaeus Claudius Nero. Sassula. Marcus Iunius Silanus. Etruria. The consuls were assigned the conduct of the war with Hannibal, for which they were to have 2 legions. Each one was to take over the troops of the previous year's consul, Quintus Fabius, and the other those of Fulvius Centumalius. In the case of the praetors, Fulvius Flaccus was to have the legions that were currently under the command of the praetor Aemilius in Luceria. Claudius Nero, those under Gaius Terentius in Picenum. Both were to supplement these troops with levies of their own. Marcus Iunius was assigned the urban legions of the previous year for service in Etruria. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Publius Sempronius Tuditanus saw their commands extended in their provinces of Lucania and Gaul, respectively, where they also retained their armies. The same applied to Publius Lentulus within the old province of Sicily, and to Marcus Marcellus in Syracuse, and what had been Hiero's kingdom. Titus Otacilius was allotted the fleet, Marcus Valerius Greece, Quintus Mucius Scaevola Sardinia, and Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius the Spanish provinces. To supplement the old armies, 2 urban legions were mobilized by the consuls, and the total number of legions for that year was 23. The consuls' troop levy was hindered by the actions of Marcus Postumus of Perga, which almost led to a riot. Postumus was a tax collector who in many years had had no equal in the state for corruption and avarice, with the exception of Titus Pomponius Variantinus, the man whom the Carthaginians under Hanno had captured the year before, as he recklessly plundered farmland in Lucania. Because in the case of goods shipped to the troops, risks from violent storms were assumed by the state, these 2 men had invented stories of shipwrecks, and even the real ones that they had reported had been due not to accidents but to their dishonesty. They would put small quantities of goods of little worth on old ships in poor repair. They would then sink the ships on the open sea, picking up the crews in boats kept ready for the purpose, and falsely report the cargoes to have been many times more valuable than they really were. This swindle had been brought to the notice of the praetor, Marcus Aemilius, the previous year, and by him it had been brought before the Senate. It had not, however, been censured by any senatorial decree because the senators were reluctant to upset the League of Tax Gatherers at such a critical time. The people proved to be stricter punishers of embezzlement. 2 of the plebeian tribunes, Spurius Carvilius and Lucius Carvilius, were prompted to take action when they saw the indignation roused by the scandalous affair, and they fined Marcus Postumius 200,000 asses. The day arrived for Postumus to challenge the ruling, and the plebeian assembly was so packed that the space before the Capitol could barely hold the crowds. After the trial wound up, the last resort for Postumius seemed to be the possibility of Gaius Servilius Casca, a plebeian tribune, who was a close relative of his, interposing his veto before the tribes could be called to vote. The tribunes furnished their witnesses and pushed back the crowd, and the urn was brought so that they could decide by lot the tribe in which the Latins would vote. Meanwhile, the tax collectors were putting pressure on Casca to suspend the day's proceedings in the assembly. The people objected to this. As it happened, Casca was sitting in front in a seat right at the end, fear and shame simultaneously preying on his mind. When there was apparently little help forthcoming from Casca, the tax collectors, in order to disrupt the proceedings, formed a phalanx, and hurling abuse at both the people and the tribunes, charged into the area that had been cleared. It had almost reached the point of open warfare, when the consul Fulvius said to the tribunes, "Do you not see that your authority has been slighted, and that a riot is coming unless you quickly dissolve the assembly of the people?" 4. The people were dismissed, and the Senate was convened. Here the consuls brought before the meeting the matter of the assembly of the people that had been disrupted by the tax-gatherers' shameless display of force. They cited, for example, the example of Marcus Furius Camillus, whose exile was likely to be followed by the city's downfall. He had accepted the sentence that was passed on him by his ungrateful compatriots. And before Camillus, there were the decemvirs, under whose legislation the Romans were living till that very day, and many other leaders of the community after them who had also accepted the judgment passed on them by the people. But Postumius of Perga had torn the vote from the hands of the Roman people. He had disrupted an assembly of the plebs, undermined the authority of the tribunes, formed a line of battle against the Roman people, and seized a position where he could keep the tribunes away from the people and prevent the tribes from being called to vote. The only thing that had stopped men from killing and fighting each other had been the understanding shown by the magistrates. They had, for the moment, yielded to the rage and recklessness of a few. They had permitted themselves and the Roman people to be overpowered, and they had, of their own accord, adjourned the assembly that the defendant intended to obstruct by armed violence. They did not want a reason for a fight being given to men who were looking for one. These words were accepted by all the more fair-minded senators as an appropriate response to the scandalous performance, and the Senate decreed that the act constituted violence against the state and set a deadly precedent. The Carvili, the plebeian tribunes, thereupon abandoned the legal contest for the fine and instead arraigned Postumius on a capital charge, giving orders for him to be arrested by an officer of the court and imprisoned if he failed to provide a bond. Postumius provided the bond, but did not appear. The tribunes then put a motion to the plebs, which the plebs ratified, that if Marcus Postumius failed to appear before the 1st of May, and if he did not respond to his summons on that day, and had not been excused, then he should be deemed to be in exile. His goods were to be sold, and he himself was to be refused water and fire as an outlaw. After that, the tribunes proceeded to arraign on a capital charge all the individuals who had been agitators in the violent disorder, and to demand bonds from them. At first they imprisoned those failing to provide a bond, and later even those who were able to provide one. Most simply went into exile, thereby avoiding the danger of this. 5. So ended the episode of the tax collector's fraud and its brazen cover-ups. Elections for the post, or Pontifex Maximus, were then held, and they were run by Marcus Cornelius Cathagus, a new pontiff. 3 men hotly contested the position: Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, the consul, who had twice been consul, and who had also been censor; Titus Manlius Torquatus, who was likewise well known for 2 consulships and a censorship; and Publius Licinius Crassus, who was about to run for the curule aedileship. In that contest the young men defeated the senior men, who had already held office. Before Crassus, no one had, over a period of 120 years, been elected Pontifex Maximus, without his first having held a curule chair. The other one exception being Publius Cornelius Calusa. The consuls had problems completing their troop levy. The shortage of younger men made it difficult for them to attain their twin objectives of enrolling fresh city legions and supplementing the old ones. The Senate instructed them not to abandon their efforts, and also gave orders for the establishment of 2 boards of triumvirs. These were to inspect the entire range of freemen in the country areas, rural towns, and administrative centers, and recruit as soldiers any who seemed to have the strength to bear arms, even if they were not yet of military age. One board was to take the area within a 50-mile radius of the city, the other the countryside beyond that point. The tribunes of the plebs, if they saw fit, were to bring before the people a proposal that the service of any who took the oath before the age of 17 should be regarded as the same as if they had entered the service at 17 or older. Following this decree of the Senate, 2 triumviral boards were established, and these conducted troop levies of freeborn men throughout the countryside. In this same period, a letter from Marcus Marcellus in Sicily was read out in the Senate. It dealt with demands made by soldiers serving under Publius Lentulus. This force, all that remained from the disaster at Cannae, had been sent off to Sicily, as noted above, and was not to be brought back to Italy before the end of the Punic War. Six. With Lentulus's permission, these men had sent their leading cavalrymen and centurions and the cream of the legionary infantry to Marcus Marcellus in his winter quarters, to act as their representatives. One of them, given permission to make a statement, spoke as follows: Marcus Marcellus, we wanted to come to you in Italy during your consulship, at the time of the passing of this decree of the Senate, which was certainly harsh, if not unfair. What held us back was wishful thinking. We thought we were being sent into a province that was in chaos after the death of its rulers, to take on a serious war against the Sicilians and Carthaginians at the same time. We felt that by shedding our blood and accepting our wounds we would make amends to the Senate, just as, in our father's time, those captured by Pyrrhus and Heraclea made amends by fighting against Pyrrhus himself. And yet, what did we do to deserve your anger at us in the past, or now, members of the Senate? For when I look at you, Marcus Marcellus, I feel that I am looking at the 2 consuls along with the entire Senate, and if we had had you as our consul at Cannae, both the Republic and we ourselves would now be in a better condition. Before I start an appeal against your treatment, please allow me to clear us of the transgression with which we are charged. If the catastrophe we suffered at Cannae is attributable to human error, and not to divine wrath or fate, by whose law all human events are immutably linked together, then whose error was it, for heaven's sake? The enlisted men's or their commanders? Now I am an enlisted man, and I would never say anything about my commander, especially when I know that he received thanks from the Senate for not having lost confidence in the Republic, and when he has seen his imperium extended every year since the rout at Cannae. It is the same for those other men who survived that disaster, men whom we had as our military tribunes. We have been told that they are running for office, holding office, and being given tours of duty. Can it be, members of the Senate, that you find it easy to pardon yourselves and your sons, and yet you vent your rage on us poor creatures? And though it was no disgrace for a consul and other leaders of the community to escape when there was no hope left, did the common soldiers have to die, come what may, when you sent them into battle? At the Alea, almost the entire army took to flight, and at the Caudine Forks the army surrendered its weapons to the enemy without so much as tasting battle. I make no mention of other shameful defeats of our armies, but there was no reason of these armies earning any disgrace. No, the city of Rome was actually retaken by the army that had fled from Alea over to Veii, and the legions from Caudium, which had returned to Rome without their weapons, were rearmed and sent back to Samnium, where they sent under the yoke the very same enemy that had earlier taken pleasure in inflicting that humiliation on them. But can anyone accuse the army at Cannae of flight or panic? More than 50,000 men lost their lives there. The consul fled with a mere 70 cavalrymen, and there were no survivors except those left by an enemy physically exhausted from killing. When the prisoners were refused ransom, we were praised in all quarters for having preserved ourselves for the good of the state, and for having returned to the consul in Venusia and presented the general appearance of a regular army. But now we are treated worse than prisoners were treated in our forefathers' time. For them, all that changed was their weapons, their military rank, and the location in which they pitched their tent in the camp. And this they remedied by one act of service to the state, by fighting one successful battle. None of them was sent into exile, none robbed of his hopes of serving out his time. They were, in short, granted an enemy, fighting whom would once and for all put an end either to their lives or to their disgrace. In our case, we can be reproached with nothing apart from seeing to it that some Roman soldiers survived the battle of Cannae. And for that, we are banished far away, not only from our home, but even from the enemy, there to grow old in exile with no hope or opportunity of removing our disgrace, allaying the anger of our fellow citizens, or even dying an honorable death. We do not ask for an end to our disgrace or a reward for our valor. Just allow us to put our spirit to the test and our courage into action. It is hardship and danger that we ask for, so that we may fulfill our role as men and soldiers. The war in Sicily is now in its second year, its ferocity intense. The Carthaginians are assaulting some cities, the Romans others. Infantry and cavalry are clashing on the field. At Syracuse, the war proceeds on land and sea. The shouting of the combatants and the clash of arms we hear as we idly fritter away our time, seemingly without weapons and the hands to use them. The consul Tiberius Sempronius has on many occasions used legions composed of slaves to engage the enemy in pitched battle. They have their liberty and the grant of citizenship as a reward for their efforts. Let us at least be regarded as your slaves, bought for this war. Give us the right to engage the enemy and seek our liberty through battle. Do you want to test our mettle on sea, on land, in the field of battle, in assaulting cities? We ask for all the harshest tasks and dangers, so that what should have been done at Cannae can be done as soon as possible. For our life since then has all been doomed to ignominy. 7. Saying this, the men fell at Marcellus's knees. Marcellus replied that he had neither the right nor the power to grant these requests, but that he would write to the Senate and follow to the letter the ruling of the members. The letter was brought to the new consuls, by whom it was read out in the Senate. When asked for its ruling, the Senate decided that it saw no reason to entrust state security to men who had abandoned their colleagues in the battle at Cannae. If the proconsul Marcus Claudius thought differently, the senators added, he could take measures that were in accord with interest of state and his own conscience. But none of the men were to be excused any duty, receive any military recognition for his courage, or be taken back to Italy for as long as the enemy remained on Italian soil. After that, elections were held by the urban praetor, following a decree of the Senate, which was ratified by the people. In these, a board of quinquevirs was elected for the repair of the city's walls and towers. 2 boards of triumvirs were also appointed, one to search out sacred objects and make an inventory of temple gifts, and the other to rebuild the temples of Fortune and Mater Matuta inside the Porta Carmentalis, and that of Hope outside the gate. The temples had been destroyed in the fire of the previous year. There were some severe storms, and on the Album Mount it rained stones continuously for 2 days. There were many places struck by lightning, 2 temples on the Capitol, and many points on the rampart in the camp above Susula, where 2 sentinels were also killed. Where 2 sentinels were also killed. The wall and a number of towers at Cumae were not merely struck by bolts of lightning, but actually knocked down. At Riat, a huge rock seemed to be in flight, and the sun was redder than usual, taking on a bloody hue. In view of these portents, there was a 1-day period of public prayer, and the consuls devoted themselves to religious observances for a number of days, which included a 9-day ceremony during that time. The defection of Tarentum was something that Hannibal had long hoped for, and that the Romans had long suspected to be coming. And as it happened, a reason for advancing its timing came up from outside. Filius of Tarentum had already been in Rome for some time, ostensibly on an embassy. A man of restless character, he had little patience with his long inactivity, in which he simply felt he was now growing old. Filius found a way of gaining access to the hostages of Tarentum and Thurii. They were under guard in the Hall of Liberty, but security was quite lax, because playing the Romans false served the interest neither of the hostages nor their states. In the course of numerous meetings, Filius won them over, and after bribing the sacristans and temple guards, he brought them out of their prison just as darkness fell. He then joined them on their secret journey and became a fugitive himself. At daybreak, news of the escape spread through the city. Men were sent in pursuit, and they caught them at Terracina and brought them all back to the city. The fugitives were ushered into the Comitium, and, with the approval of the people, they were flogged and hurled down from the rock. 8. The brutality of this punishment caused ill feeling in the 2 most famous Greek city-states in Italy, and on a personal as well as national level, insofar as individuals were connected by family or friendship with the men who had faced such horrible deaths. Some 13 such people, young noblemen of Tarentum, formed a conspiracy, its leaders being Nico and Philomenes. The conspirators felt they should discuss matters with Hannibal before making any more, and so, leaving the city on the pretense of going hunting, they set off at night to see him. When they were not far from the Carthaginian camp, the others hid in the wood close to the road while Nico and Philomenes went ahead to the guard posts. They were arrested at their own request, brought to Hannibal. They told him the reasons for their plot and what they planned on doing, and for this they received high praise from Hannibal, who showered them with promises. They were then instructed to drive back to the city some cattle of the Carthaginians that had been turned out to graze, in order to convince their compatriots that they had left the city on a plundering expedition. They were assured that they would be safe doing this and would encounter no opposition. The plunder of the young men received some attention, and their second and subsequent forays caused less surprise. Meeting Hannibal again, they secured an assurance from him that after their liberation the people of Tarentum would retain their own laws and keep their possessions, and would not pay tax to the Carthaginians or have a garrison installed against their wishes. After its betrayal, the Roman garrison was to be in the hands of the Carthaginians. After they reached this agreement, Philomenes made a more regular practice of leaving and returning to the city at night. He did, in fact, have a reputation for his passion for hunting, and he always had his dogs and other hunting equipment with him. He would usually bag something, or he was brought something by the enemy by previous arrangement. This he would carry back and present it to the commander or the guards at the gates as a gift. His choice of the night as the time for his comings and goings was, they believed, prompted by the fear of the enemy. By now, Philomenes' practice had become so routine that when he gave his signal with a whistle, no matter what the time of night, the gate would be opened for him, and Hannibal decided the time for action had come. He was 3 days' march from the town, and to lessen surprise at his remaining encamped in the same spot for so long, he feigned illness. Even the Romans in the garrison at Tarentum had by now ceased to be suspicious at his prolonged inactivity. (9) After deciding to march to Tarentum, Hannibal picked out 10,000 infantry and cavalrymen, whom he thought best suited for the mission by virtue of their speed and light armor, and moved out at the 4th watch of the night. He sent ahead a force of about 80 Numidian horsemen, with orders to ride through the area surrounding the roads and conduct a thorough reconnaissance to ensure that no peasant spotted his column from a distance, unbeknownst to them. Any peasants who were ahead of them, they were to turn back, and they were to kill any they met, so that the local people would have the impression they were raiders rather than a regular army. Hannibal himself marched the army forward at a swift pace, pitching camp from some 15 miles from Tarentum. Not even at that point did he announce their objective. He merely summoned the men and told them to keep to the road and not let anyone stray from it or break ranks as they marched. Above all, they were to stay alert to catch their orders, and do anything and not do anything unless commanded to do so by their officers. Hannibal would let them know at the appropriate moment what he wanted done. It was at about that same hour of the day that a rumor had reached Tarentum that a few Numidian horsemen were raiding the fields, and had struck panic into the country people far and wide. The Roman commander's reaction to the news was no more than to issue orders for some of his cavalry to go out at dawn the following day to keep the enemy from plundering. So negligible was his vigilance in all other respects that he even accepted the Numidians' raid as evidence that Hannibal and his army had not broken camp. Hannibal moved forward in the early hours of darkness. His guide was Philomenus, who had with him his customary load of game. The rest of the traders were waiting to make their contribution to the pact. It had been agreed that Philomenus would take his game in by the small entranceway he normally used, and bring some armored men in with him, while Hannibal would approach the Temenid gate from another direction. That area of town is on the landward side, facing east, and tombs take up a considerable space inside the walls. As Hannibal approached the gate, he lit a torch and prearranged a signal, and the same signal gleamed back from Nico. Then both lights were extinguished. Hannibal led his men to the gate in silence, and Nico made a surprise attack on the sleeping guards, killed them in their beds, and threw open the gate. Hannibal entered the town with his infantry column, but instructed his cavalry to remain behind, so they would be free to charge over the open plain to wherever they might be needed. On the other side of town, Philomenus, too, was now approaching the little entranceway through which he had been regularly coming and going. His familiar voice and the well-known signal woke the sentry, and just as Philomenus was commenting that a beast of that size was almost too heavy to carry, the gate was opened. Two young men brought in a wild boar, and Philomenus and a hunter, who was carrying little equipment, came in after them. The sentry turned to the bearers with too little caution, amazed at the animal's size, and Philomenus ran him through with a hunting spear. Then some 30 armed men entered, cut down the other sentries, and smashed in the gate next to the entranceway, and with that a column immediately burst into the town in regular formation. From there they had marched in silence into the forum, where they joined Hannibal. The Carthaginian formed up to 2,000 Gauls in 3 divisions, and sent them off through the city, giving each division 2 men of Tarentum as guides. He gave orders for the busiest thoroughfares to be secured, and, when the uproar started, for the Romans to be indiscriminately massacred, but the Tarentines spared. To make that possible, he issued instructions to his young Tarentine supporters to tell any of their townspeople that they saw in the distance to remain calm, stay silent, and keep their hopes up. 10. By now, there was the uproar and shouting that occurs when a city is captured. But what was happening nobody really knew. The people of Tarentum thought the Romans had risen up to pillage their city. To the Romans it seemed to be some kind of treacherous uprising by the townspeople. The garrison commander, awakened by the initial commotion, slipped away to the harbor, where he was taken aboard a boat and ferried around to the citadel. Uncertainty was compounded by a bugle call heard coming from the theatre. It was a Roman bugle, acquired ahead of time by the conspirators for this very purpose. But it was also blown ineptly by a Greek, making it unclear who was giving the signal and to whom it was being given. When daylight came, the Romans recognized the Carthaginian and Gallic armor, and this removed all doubt from their minds. And the sight of butchered Romans lying everywhere made the Greeks aware, too, that the city had been captured by Hannibal. The light grew stronger. The Romans who had survived the massacre had taken refuge in the citadel, and the uproar gradually began to die down. At this point, Hannibal had the people of Tarentum summoned without weapons. They all assembled, apart from those who had followed the Romans when they retreated to the citadel, ready to share with them whatever fortune had in store. At the meeting, Hannibal made a conciliatory address to the Tarentines, reminding them of his kind treatment of their fellow citizens whom he had taken prisoner at Trasimene and Cannae, and at the same time berating the Romans for their high-handed governance. He then told them to return to their homes and write their names on their doors. He said that he would immediately give a signal for houses that were not so marked to be looted, and that he would regard as an enemy anyone who wrote his name on a dwelling inhabited by a Roman citizen. For the Romans were occupying vacant houses. The meeting was then adjourned. When the doors had been marked with names distinguishing a friendly habitation from that of a foe, a signal was given, and men rushed off in all directions to loot the Romans' living quarters, and a substantial quantity of plunder was taken. 11. The next day, Hannibal led his men to launch an attack on the citadel. He could see, however, that it could not be taken by storm or by siege works, since the section facing the sea, and it is mostly surrounded by the sea, like a peninsula, was protected by towering cliffs, and on the side of the city his defenses were a wall and a huge moat. He was, however, concerned that the effort of safeguarding the Tarentines would hold him back from more significant operations, whereas if these were left without a strong defensive force, the Romans could attack them from the citadel whenever they liked. He decided, therefore, to isolate the city from the citadel by means of earthworks. He was not without hope, too, that the Romans would try to block the work, and could be drawn into an engagement. In fact, if their attack were too confident, he hoped that the strength of their garrison would be reduced by heavy casualties to the point where the Tarentines might easily be able to defend the city against them on their own. When the construction had got under way, the gate was suddenly flung open, and the Romans attacked the working parties. The guards in the post in front of the works allowed themselves to be driven back, so that the Romans, their recklessness growing with success, would chase their defeated foe in greater numbers, and over a greater distance. Then a signal was given, and the Carthaginians, whom Hannibal had kept formed up just for this purpose, rose to the attack on every side. The Romans could not withstand the assault, but the restricted space and the obstacles they faced in the works already under construction, and the building materials for the others, impeded their headlong flight. Large numbers threw themselves into the moat, and the loss of life was greater in the retreat than in the fighting. After that there was no obstruction when work recommenced. A huge ditch was dug, and earthwork was erected behind it, and a short distance away Hannibal was also preparing a wall running parallel to them, to give the Tarentines the capability to defend themselves against the Romans, even without a garrison. He did, nevertheless, leave behind a garrison of modest proportions, which would also be able to help with the completion of the wall, and he then set off with the rest of his troops and encamped at the river Galesus, which is 5 miles from the city. When Hannibal returned from this camp to inspect the work, it had progressed with considerably greater speed than he had expected, and he conceived the hope that the citadel could even be taken by assault. In fact, its security does not lie in its height, as with other citadels. It is situated on level ground, and is cut off from the city only by a wall and a moat. The attack was going ahead, with all kinds of assault machinery and siege works, when the Romans received armed assistance from Metapontum, giving them the courage to launch a surprise attack at night on the enemy works. They smashed some, and others they destroyed by fires, and that spelled the end of Hannibal's assault on the citadel from that direction. The only remaining hope was a blockade that was unlikely to be very effective. However, because the citadel was on a peninsula and overlooking the harbor mouth, giving those holding its free access to the sea, the city, by contrast, was cut off from seaborne supplies, and a besieging force was more likely to starve than the besieged. Hannibal called the leading Tarentines together and explained all the problems they faced. He could see no way of taking such a well-protected citadel by assault, and he had no confidence in a blockade either, as long as the enemy controlled the sea. But if he had ships with which he could head off the conveyance of supplies, he added, the enemy would either immediately leave the citadel or surrender. The Tarentines agreed, but said they thought that the man responsible for the idea should also be responsible for providing the means to carry it out. Punic ships, brought from Sicily, could achieve this end, they said, but their own ships were confined within a narrow bay with the enemy in control of the harbor entrance. How could they possibly make it out to the open sea? They will make it out, said Hannibal. Many problems that nature points in one way are solved by thinking them through. You have a city that lies on a plain. You have streets that are level and very broad, running in all directions. I shall transport the ships on wagons along the street that runs through the city center from the harbor to the sea. It will not take much effort, and the sea that the enemy now controls will be ours. Then we shall blockade the citadel by sea on the one side, and by land on the other. No, rather, we shall soon capture it, either abandoned by its defenders, or along with its defenders. These comments aroused not only hopes for success, but admiration for the commander. Wagons were immediately assembled from all quarters and lashed together. Cranes were brought up for hauling the ships ashore, and improvements made to the road to ease the passage of the carts and lighten the effort of moving them. Then pack animals and workmen were brought together, and the work started with gusto. And so, A few days later, a fleet that was equipped and ready for action sailed around the citadel, and dropped anchor right before the harbor mouth. This was how Hannibal left matters at Tarentum when he returned to his winter quarters. Whether the defection of the Tarentines occurred in the previous year or in this year is, however, disputed by historians, though most, including those living closer to the time when the facts were still remembered, place it in this year. 12. Back in Rome, the Latin festival kept the consuls and praetors in the city until the 27th of April. On that day they performed the sacrifice on Album Mount, and then set off for their various provinces. After that, fresh religious impediments arose as a result of the prophecies of Marcius. This Marcius had been a famous prophet, and during the Senate authorized hunt for documents of this kind the previous year. His prophetic verses had fallen into the hands of Marcus Aemilius, the urban praetor, who was conducting the search. Aemilius had immediately passed them on to the new praetor, Sulla. There were two predictions made by this Marcius. One of them was made public only after the relevant event, but the authority it acquired by its fulfillment added credibility to the other, the time for which had not arrived. In the first prophecy, the disaster at Cannae had been predicted in words much as follows: Child of Troy, flee the river Cannae, lest men from abroad force you to do battle on Diomede's plain. But you will not believe me until you have filled the plain with blood, and the river bears your dead in many thousands from fertile land to the great sea. For fish and birds and beasts that dwell on the land, let your flesh be food. For this has Jupiter said to me. And indeed, those who had fought in the area recognized in the prophecy the plains of the Argive Diomedes and the river Cannae, as well as the defeat itself. The second prophecy was then read out. This was not only more difficult to fathom because the future is less clear than the past, but was also more cryptic in the way it was written. Romans, if you wish to drive out the enemy, the tumor that comes from afar, my advice is to dedicate games to Apollo, annual games to be held with good cheer in Apollo's honor. When the people have given part from the public purse, then let private individuals contribute it for themselves and their relatives. The praetor, who will be dispensing supreme justice to the people and plebeians, shall be in charge of the conduct of such games. The decemvirs should offer sacrifice after the Greek manner. If you do this correctly, you shall rejoice forever, and your circumstances shall improve. For he will wipe out your enemies, that one of the gods who gently nourishes your fields. The authorities spent one day deciphering the prophetic verse, and on the next came a decree of the Senate bidding the decemvirs to consult the Sibylline books about games in Apollo's honor and sacrificial offerings to him. After these had consulted the books and reported their findings to the Senate, the senators decided that games be offered in a vow to Apollo and held in his honor. After the holding of the games, 12,000 asses and 2 full-grown sacrificial victims were to be given to the praetor for the religious ceremony. A second senatorial decree stipulated that the decemvirs were to conduct the ceremony after the Greek manner, and with the following sacrificial victims for Apollo: an ox with gilded horns, and 2 white she-goats with gilded horns for Latona, a cow with gilded horns. When the praetor was about to open the games in the Circus Maximus, he made a proclamation that during the period of the games the people should make an offering of money to Apollo that they could comfortably afford. Such is the origin of the Apolline Games. Such is the origin of the Apolline Games, which were vowed and instituted to secure victory, and not good health, as most people think. The people watched the events wearing garlands, and matrons offered prayers. All over the city, dinners were held in the forecourts of houses, with doors left open, and the day was solemnized with all manner of ceremonies. 13. Hannibal was now in the neighborhood of Tarentum, and both the consuls, though both were in Samnium, clearly intended to blockade Capua. The people of Capua were, in fact, already experiencing hunger, the usual cruel result of protracted siege, because the Roman armies had prevented them from seeding their fields. They therefore sent spokesmen to Hannibal and begged him to have grain transported to Capua from the neighboring districts before the consuls could bring their legions into the Capuan countryside, and there were enemy roadblocks everywhere. Hannibal instructed Hanno to cross over with his army from Bruttium into Campania, and make every effort to have the Campanians provisioned with grain. Hanno left Bruttium with his army, and taking care to avoid the enemy camp and the consuls in Samnium, approached Beneventum, encamping on some elevated ground 3 miles from the actual city. He gave orders for grain to be carted into his camp from the allied peoples round about, with whom it had been stockpiled in the summer, and he provided an armed escort for the consignments. He next sent a message to Capua, indicating the date on which people should be present in the camp to accept the grain, and telling them to come with all manner of carts and pack animals, which they should gather in from the countryside. Hanno's instructions were followed by the Capuans, with their typical lethargy and carelessness, and not many more than 400 carts and a few pack animals were actually sent along. For this they were reproached by Hanno, who told them that even the hunger that provoked dumb animals to action could not stimulate them to make an effort, and another date was fixed for them to come with more equipment to collect their grain. All these developments were reported as they happened to the people of Beneventum, and Beneventans lost no time in sending 10 envoys to the consuls. The Roman camp was close to Bovianum. When the consuls heard what was happening to Capua, they came to an agreement that one of them should take his army into Campania. Fulvius, to whom this area of responsibility had fallen by Sortition, then set off and entered the fortifications of Beneventum during the night. Now, close to the action, Fulvius learned that Hanno had left on a forage. Now close to the action, Fulvius learned that Hanno had left on a foraging expedition with a section of his army, that the Capuans had been supplied with grain by Hanno's quaestor, and that 2,000 wagons and a motley crowd of unarmed men had arrived. Confusion and panic reigned everywhere, he was told, and camp organization and military routine had been undermined by peasants and slaves who had also come on the scene. After having this confirmed, the consul instructed his men to get ready only their standards and weapons for the oncoming night. They had to attack the Punic camp. Leaving all their kit and baggage at Beneventum, they set out at the fourth watch and reached the camp shortly before dawn. Such was the panic they struck in the enemy that there was no doubt that the camp could have been taken at the first assault, had it lain on level ground. It was its elevation and fortifications unreachable on any side except by a steep and difficult slope that protected it. At daybreak, a fierce battle broke out, and the Carthaginians not only defended their rampart, but also, having the territorial advantage, flung down their enemies as they struggled up the heights. 14. Unflagging courage, however, conquers all, and the Romans reached the rampart and ditches at several places at the same time, though at a heavy cost in wounds and soldiers' lives. The consul therefore summoned his legates and military tribunes, and told them they had to abandon this reckless venture. It seemed to him safer to take the army back to Beneventum that day, he said, and then, on the following, to pitch their camp close to the camp of the enemy, in order to prevent the Campanians from leaving or Hanno from coming back. To make that easier, he would also send for his colleague and his forces, and together they would bring all their military resources to bear on this one objective. Such was the commander's plan of campaign, but it was scattered to the winds just as he was sounding the retreat, by the shouts of soldiers indignantly rejecting the spineless order. The unit closest to the enemy happened to be a Pelagian cohort. It's perfect. Vibius Accius grabbed the cohort's banner and hurled it over the enemy rampart. He then called down curses on himself and on the cohort if the enemy got their hands on the banner, and forging ahead of the others over ditch and rampart, he burst into the Carthaginian camp. The Peligni were now fighting within the enemy rampart, while on the other side of the camp, Valerius Flaccus, military tribune of the 3rd Legion, was severely reprimanding the Romans for their cowardice in ceding to allies the distinction of taking the camp. Then Titus Bedanius, the 1st centurion of the Principes, took the standard from the bearer and declared, "This standard and the centurion are soon going to be inside the enemy rampart. Those who are going to prevent its capture by the enemy follow me." As he crossed the ditch, his comrades from his maniple were the first to follow him, and then the whole legion came after them. The sight of the men crossing the ditch changed the consul's mind. Now he turned from recalling them and trying to bring them back, to urging them on and giving encouragement, and he pointed out the dangerous predicament in which the bravest of the allied cohorts and a legion of their fellow citizens now found themselves. And so, with each man making an effort, they clambered over ground easy and difficult under showers of missiles, hurled from every direction, and with the enemy blocking them with their weapons and their bodies, and burst into the camp. Many of the wounded, even as strength and blood drained from them, strained to fall within the enemy rampart. And so, in an instant, the camp was taken, as if it had been sitting in the plain without fortifications. Then, as the two sides swarmed together within the rampart, it was a bloodbath, and no longer a battle. More than 6,000 of the enemy were killed. More than 7,000 men were taken prisoner, and captured along with them were the Capuans, who had come for the grain, and the whole array of wagons and pack animals. There was also a huge store of plunder that Hanno had hauled from the fields of Roman allies at that time when he had gone off on his widespread raids. After that, the Romans destroyed the enemy camp and returned to Beneventum. There the two consuls for Appius Claudius also arrived a few days later, sold the booty, and divided the proceeds. In addition, the men whose efforts had resulted in the capture of the enemy camp were rewarded, especially Accius, the Pelagian, and Titus Pedanius, the first centurion of the 3rd Legion. News of the loss of the camp reached Hanno in Cominium Acritum. He left the town along with a few foragers that he had happened to have with him, and his return to Bruttium was more like a flight than a march. When they heard about the disaster that had struck both them and their allies, the Capuans sent envoys to Hannibal to report that two consuls were at Beneventum, a mere day's march from Capua, which meant that the war was practically at their gates and walls. If Hannibal did not come swiftly with aid, then Capua would fall into the hands of the enemy more quickly than Arpi had done. The envoys were to impress on him that he should not set such great store by Tarentum, and much less by just its citadel, as to deliver Capua, which he had habitually compared with Carthage, to the Roman people abandoned and undefended. Hannibal promised to take care of the situation in Campania, and as a temporary measure sent 2,000 cavalry with the envoys, so the Campanians could use this force to protect their farms from enemy depredations. The Romans, meanwhile, were preoccupied with a number of things, including the citadel of Tarentum and the garrison under siege within it. One senatorial authority, the legate Gaius Servilius, had been dispatched to Etruria to purchase grain by the praetor Publius Cornelius, and he made it into the harbor of Tarentum with a number of loaded ships, slipping between the enemy patrols. Thanks to his arrival, the people, who, as hope faded, had been invited to change sides at various meetings with the enemy, now themselves began to invite and coax the enemy to change sides. And in fact, The garrison was now of sufficient strength, since men who had earlier been stationed in Metapontum had been reassigned to the defense of the citadel of Tarentum. The result of that was that the people of Metapontum, suddenly unburdened by the fear of which they had been held in check, went over to Hannibal. The same thing also happened with the people of Thurii on the same coastline. What motivated these was not so much the defection of the peoples of Tarentum and the Metapontum, with whom they actually shared a bond of kinship, the two having the same land of origin, Achaia, as their anger with the Romans over the recent execution of their hostages. The friends and relatives of the victims sent letters and messages to Hanno and Mago, who were close by in Bruttium, informing them that if the two generals brought any army up to their walls, they would deliver the city into their hands. The Roman commander at Thurii was Marcus Atinius, who had only a small garrison, and the conspirators thought he could easily be enticed into recklessly engaging in battle through confidence, not in his men, whose numbers were very small, but in the young men of Thurii. Atinius had made a point of forming these up in centuries, and equipping them with weapons to meet such emergencies. The Carthaginian commanders divided their forces and marched into the territory of Thurii. Hanno proceeded to the city with the infantry column drawn up ready for action, and Mago, with the cavalry, took up a position under the cover of some hills that were conveniently situated for concealing an ambush. From his scouts, Atinius had learned only about the infantry column, and he led out his troops for battle, unaware of the conspiracy within the city, and the ambush set by the enemy. The infantry engagement was sluggish. There were few Romans in the front line, and the Thurians were waiting for, rather than helping to achieve an outcome. The Carthaginian line now began deliberately to fall back, to draw the unsuspecting enemy behind the hill occupied by their cavalry. When they reached that point, the Carthaginian cavalry charged to the attack with a shout, swiftly driving off the mass of Thurians, who were almost in chaos, and had little loyalty to the side on which they stood. The Romans, surrounded and under pressure from the infantry on one front and from the cavalry on the other, still managed to keep up the fight for a time. Eventually they too turned and fled to the city. In town the conspirators had banded together, and with the gates wide open they let in the body of their compatriots. But when they saw the defeated Romans surging towards the city, they cried out that the Carthaginians were hard on their heels, and that the enemy would also come into the city mixed with the fugitives, if the Thurians did not swiftly close the gates. And so they shut out the Romans, offering them up to the enemy for slaughter, though Atinius and a few others were admitted. Discord followed for a time, as some advocated remaining true to Rome, and others felt they should accept what fortune brought, and surrender the city to the visitors. As usual, however, fortune and bad advice carried the day. Atinius and his entourage were taken to some ships on the shore, more because the Thurians were concerned for him personally because of his clement and fair jurisdiction over them, than from any regard for the Romans. They then admitted the Carthaginians into the city. The consuls marched their legions from Beneventum into Campanian territory, intending not only to destroy the grain that was already sprouting, but also to make an attack on Capua. They thought that destroying such a wealthy city would add luster to their consulship, and that they would, at the same time, be removing from the empire the deep disgrace of leaving the secession of a nearby city unpunished for more than 2 years. But they did not want Beneventum left without a garrison, and they also wanted to have the ability to face military emergencies and stem the violence of Hannibal's cavalry should he come to Capua to assist his allies, as they were sure he would. Accordingly, they instructed Tiberius Gracchus to come from Lucania to Beneventum with his cavalry and light infantry, and told him to put someone in command of the legions and camp in Lucania, in order to retain control of the region. 16. Before moving out of Lucania, Gracchus conducted a sacrifice, and there was a grim portent. The sacrificial act completed, 2 snakes slithered unobtrusively up to the entrails and ate part of the liver. And then, when they were spotted, they suddenly disappeared. Therefore, on the advice of the seers, the sacrifice was repeated, and greater care was taken with the entrails. But tradition has it that the snakes slithered up on the second and third occasion, tasted the liver, and left unharmed. The seers gave advance warnings that the focus of the omen was on the commander, and that he should be on his guard against men working and planning against him in secret. However, his impending doom could be averted by no clairvoyance. The Lucanian Flavius was leader of the faction of the Lucanians that remained pro-Roman when some of the people defected to Hannibal. He had been elected praetor by the members of his faction, and was already in his 2nd year of office. He suddenly changed his sympathies and looked for an opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Carthaginians. He did not feel that simply deserting and drawing the Lucanians into defection was enough. He had to endorse his pact with the enemy by betraying his commander, who was also a personal friend, and taking the man's life. Flavius came to talk in secret with Mago, the Carthaginian commander in Bruttium, and was given an assurance that the Lucanians should live as free men under their own constitution, and enjoy the friendship of the Carthaginians if he delivered the Roman commander to them. He then took the Carthaginian to a place to which he said he would bring Gracchus, along with a small escort. He told Mago to hide some armed infantry and cavalry there, noting that the hiding place could hold a large number of men. When they had thoroughly inspected and patrolled the location, a date was set for executing the plan. Flavius came next to the Roman commander. He had embarked on an important project, he told them, but he needed Gracchus's personal assistance to put the final touches to it. He had convinced the praetors of all those peoples who had defected to the Carthaginian during the general unrest in Italy to return to their treaties of friendship with Rome. He had impressed on them that the situation of Rome, which had come close to ruin with the disaster at Cannae, was becoming better and stronger each day, while Hannibal's power was weakening and had almost vanished. As for their past offense, the Romans would not be unforgiving. He had told them no people had ever shown themselves more clement or ready to forgive. Witness the number of times even the Lucanians' ancestors had been forgiven for their insurrections. These points he had himself made to the praetors, said Flavius, but they preferred to hear the same things directly from Gracchus, and to have him present so they could grasp his right hand and take away with them his assurance of his good faith. He had fixed a venue for their meeting, he said, one that was secluded and not far from the Roman camp, and there it would take only a few words to have all the Lucanian people under the protection of Rome and allied with her. Gracchus suspected no treachery in the man's words or the project, and he was taken in by the plausible scenario. Leaving camp with his lictors and a cavalry squadron, and guided by his personal friend, he fell right into the trap. The enemy suddenly rose up, and to leave no doubt about the betrayal, Flavius joined them. Missiles were hurled at Gracchus and his horsemen from every direction. He dismounted, ordering the others to do the same, and exhorting them to embellish with their valor the one option that fortune had left them. They were few in number, surrounded by a host of men, in a valley enclosed by forest and hills. That was left for them. What was left for them but death? He asked. What mattered now was whether they were going to be butchered without retaliation, offering up their bodies like cattle, or whether they would, instead, reject completely the idea of submissively awaiting the outcome and launch a furious attack on the enemy. Would they take action and show defiance and fall covered with the blood of their foe amidst the mounds of their dying enemies, weapons and bodies? They must all make their target the Lucanian who betrayed and deserted them, said Gracchus. The man who sent that victim down to the underworld ahead of himself would win outstanding honor and singular consolation for his own death. So saying, Gracchus wrapped his general's cloak around his left arm. They had not even brought their shields with them and rushed at the enemy. The ensuing fight was fiercer than the numbers involved would have led one to expect. It was to the javelins that the Romans were most exposed, and by these they were being transfixed as the enemy could hurl them down from their higher positions into the sunken hollow. Gracchus was by now stripped of his escort, and the Carthaginians were attempting to take him alive. But he caught sight of his Lucanian friend in the enemy's midst, and made such a furious charge into the closely packed group that sparing his life was impossible without the loss of many men. Mago immediately sent the dead body to Hannibal, with instructions for it to be set before the general's tribunal, together with the fasces that had been taken. If this is the correct version, Gracchus fell at the so-called old fields of Lucania. 17. There are some who place Gracchus's death near the river Calor in the area of Beneventum. He had left his camp with his lictors and 3 slaves to wash himself down, these people claim, and some of the enemy happened to be hiding among the willows growing on the river bank. He was killed, naked and unarmed, as he fought back with the stones that the river rolled along. There are others whose accounts have him going a half-mile from the camp, on the advice of his seers, to expiate on pure soil the portents mentioned above, and being surrounded by 2 squadrons of Numidians, who chanced to be lying in ambush there. Such is the uncertainty surrounding where and how such a famous and distinguished man met his end. Accounts of Gracchus's funeral also vary. Some report that he was buried by his own men in the Roman camp. Others, and this is the more widespread version, claim that the pyre was erected for him on Hannibal's orders in the area before the Carthaginian camp. Then the army paraded in battle dress, with the Spaniards performing dances, and all the tribes using their bodies and weapons to execute their traditional movements, and Hannibal himself did and said whatever he could to honor the man's funeral. Such is the account of authors who locate the events in Lucania. If one prefers to accept the version of those who put his death at the river Calor, then Gracchus's enemies took possession of his head only. The head was brought to Hannibal, who immediately dispatched Carthalo to take it to the quaestor Gnaeus Cornelius in the Roman camp. Cornelius held the commander's funeral in the camp, and the people of Beneventrum joined the army in the ceremonies. 18. After entering the farmlands of Campania, the consuls were conducting widespread raids when a counterattack from the townspeople and from Mago and his cavalry filled them with alarm. Panicking, they called their widely scattered men back to the standards. But they were routed after barely forming a battle line, with the loss of more than 1,500 soldiers. The Campanians were a temperamentally arrogant people, and after this incident, their belligerence increased enormously. They began to harass the Romans with numerous engagements, but the single battle that they had incautiously and unwisely joined had made the consuls more prone to caution. Nevertheless, one minor event came to restore the confidence of the one side, and curtail the recklessness of the other. And yet in warfare, nothing is so insignificant that it cannot at times have important consequences. Titus Quinctius Crispinus had a personal friend from Capua called Badius, with whom he had very strong ties of hospitality. Their friendship had intensified because before the defection of the Capuans, Badius had fallen sick in Rome, and had received generous and obliging treatment at Crispinus' house. This Badius now advanced beyond the Roman guard post in front of the camp gate, and asked for Crispinus to be summoned. When Crispinus was given the message, he assumed that the point of the summons was a friendly, personal conversation, and that despite the breakdown of the treaties between their peoples, there still remained the memory of their private relationship. He therefore went towards Badius slightly ahead of his comrades. When the two came in sight of each other, Badius said, "Crispinus, I challenge you to a duel. Let us mount our horses, move others aside, and see which of the two of us is superior in combat. Crispinus' reply was that neither he nor Badius was short of people on whom to demonstrate their prowess. Even if he met Badius in battle, he would refuse to fight him, he said, for fear of sullying his right hand with the blood of a man with whom he had ties of mutual hospitality. With that, he turned and left. At this point, the Campanian became even more truculent, taunting Crispinus with being a spineless coward and showering on the innocent man insults that he himself deserved. He called Crispinus his social enemy, and said that he was simply making a pretense of showing mercy to a man for whom he knew he was no match. If Crispinus did not think that their personal relationship was not also shattered with the rupture of their people's treaties, then he, Badius of Campania, now publicly declared in the hearing of two armies that he was renouncing his social ties with the Roman Titus Quinctius Crispinus. He was Crispinus's enemy, and had no relationship, no bond with this enemy, who had come to attack his homeland, and the gods of his people, and of his own house. If Crispinus were a man, Badius concluded, he should face him in battle. Crispinus hesitated for some time, but his comrades in his squadron pushed him not to let the Campanian get away with his insults. He waited only long enough to ask his commander's permission to leave the ranks to fight an enemy who was challenging him. Then, with their leave, he seized his weapons, mounted his horse, and, calling on Badius by name, summoned him to combat. There was no hesitation on the Campanian's part, and the two clashed on charging steeds. Crispinus thrust his spear into Badius's left arm, above his shield, and when the wound unseated the Campanian, he jumped onto him from his horse to finish him off on foot as he lay on the ground. Before he could be caught, Badius ran back to his own side, leaving his shield and his horse behind, proudly displaying the horse and the arms that he had taken and his bloody lance. Crispinus was conducted to the consuls, resplendent with his trophies, while the men loudly cheered and congratulated him. There he was giving a magnificent commendation, and presented with gifts. 19. Now moved camp from the area of Beneventum towards Capua, and 2 days after his arrival, he led his troops into combat. He had no doubt that after the Campanian's successful engagement during the absence a few days earlier, the Romans would be much less capable of resisting him and his army, which had won so many victories. From the start of the battle, the Roman line was under pressure, mostly because of a cavalry charge that subjected it to a hail of javelins, until the signal was given to the Roman cavalry to charge the enemy. It thus became a cavalry engagement, but then Sempronius's army, now commanded by the quaestor Gnaeus Cornelius, was spotted in the distance, and this struck fear in both sides alike that fresh forces of the enemy were arriving. On both sides, as though by agreement, the signal for retreat was given, and the men were led back to their camps, parting on almost equal terms, though losses were heavier on the Roman side, thanks to the initial cavalry attack. In an attempt to divert Hannibal from Capua, the consuls left there the following night, moving in opposite directions. Fulvius heading into the countryside of Cumae, and Claudius into Lucania. The following day, Hannibal was brought word that the Roman camp was deserted, and that the enemy had gone off as two columns in opposite directions. Unsure at first which one to follow, he eventually set off in pursuit of Appius. After leading his enemy where his fancy took him, Appius returned to Capua by another road. Hannibal was offered a second chance of success in the area. There was one Marcus Centenius, surnamed Panula, who stood out amongst the leading Roman centurions for his large build and courage. The man who had completed this his term of service was brought before the Senate by the praetor Publius Cornelius Sulla, and there he requested of the senators that he be assigned 5,000 men. He knew both the enemy and the country, he explained, and he would soon make the investment worthwhile. He would turn against their originator those very tactics by which both our commanders and our armies had been taken by surprise. The promise was foolish, but just as foolish was the credence it received, as though the skills of a soldier were the same as those of a commander. Centenius was assigned not 5,000 but 8,000 men, half of them citizens, half allies. In addition, he personally raised a number of volunteers in the countryside en route, and he arrived in Lucania, where Hannibal had come to a halt after an unsuccessful pursuit of Claudius, with an army that had almost doubled in size. There was no doubt about the outcome of the battle between a commander like Hannibal and a centurion, and between an army seasoned from victory and one completely new that was, for the most part, an assortment of poorly equipped men. The columns caught sight of each other. Neither side declined battle. The lines were immediately drawn up, but the battle reflected the inequality of the situation, though hope sustained the Roman line for more than 2 hours, as long as the leader stood his ground. But to protect his reputation of old, and fearing also the disgrace of surviving a disaster brought on by his own recklessness, Centenius deliberately exposed himself to his enemy's weapons and met his end. After that, the Roman line was immediately driven back, but all the roads were blocked by cavalry, and so restricted was their avenue of escape that from such a huge force scarcely 1,000 managed to get away, while the others perished, right and left, by one means or another. 20. The consuls now recommended an all-out blockade of Capua, and all the materials for the operation were brought together and made ready for action. Grain was stockpiled at Casilinum, and a fortress was built at the mouth of the Volturnus, where a city stands today. A garrison was established in the fort and also at Puteoli, which Fabius Maximus had already fortified. So the Romans would have the river and the sea nearby in their power. Grain had recently been sent from Sardinia, and the praetor Marcus Iunius had bought more from Etruria. This was now transported from Ostia to these two maritime strongholds, so that the army would be provisioned through the winter. To add to the defeat suffered in Lucania, however, the army was volunteer slaves deserted its standards. To add to the defeat suffered in Lucania, however, the army of volunteer slaves deserted its standards. It had served with unswerving loyalty while Gracchus was alive, but felt that the leader's death released it from its obligations. Hannibal was reluctant to leave Capua neglected, and his allies deserted at such a critical moment, but after the success that came his way from the recklessness of one Roman leader, he was on the lookout for an opportunity to surprise a second leader and a second army. Apulian envoys now kept bringing him reports on the praetor Gnaeus Fulvius. They told him that, at first, while he was attacking some Apulian cities that had gone over to Hannibal, Fulvius had done his job with considerable diligence, but that subsequently too much success had made him and his booty-laden soldiers so neglectful and apathetic that military discipline was non-existent. Hannibal, who had on many other occasions, and particularly in the past few days, seen what an army could be like under an inept commander, moved his camp to Apulia. 21. The Roman legions and the praetor Fulvius were in the neighborhood of Herdonia, and when the news reached them of the enemy's approach, they all but broke camp and went into battle without the praetor's order. What held them back more than anything was the certainty they felt that they could do this whenever they wished, at a moment convenient to them. Knowing that, there had been a disturbance in the camp, with several people raising the call to arms and aggressively pushing the general to give the signal. Hannibal had no doubt that he was being offered the chance of a successful engagement. And so, that night, he stationed 3,000 light-armed men in nearby farms, and in undergrowth and woods, with orders to emerge all together from their cover. When given the sign, he also instructed Mago and some 2,000 horsemen to secure all the roads at the points where they thought the enemy would flee. After making these preparations during the night, Hannibal led his troops out for battle at dawn. Fulvius showed no hesitation either, drawn into action less by his own hopes than by the impulsive reaction of his men. They formed up with the same lack of caution with which they had proceeded to the engagement, and at the whim of the common soldiers, who ran forward haphazardly to take any position they fancied, and then abandoned it on impulse or from fear. The first legion and the left allied wing were drawn up at the front, and the line was disproportionately long. The tribunes cried out that there was no firmness or strength within the battle line, and that the enemy would break through wherever they attacked. But the men refused to hear, much less accept, any salutary advice. And there, on the field, was Hannibal, a general not like their own, and with an army that was not like theirs, or drawn up after their manner. The result was that the Romans failed to resist even their war cry and initial charge. Their leader was Centinius, equal in stupidity and recklessness, but was not in his class for courage. When he saw things go against him and his men in panic, he grabbed a horse and made off with about 200 cavalrymen. The rest of the force driven back at the front, and then encircled to the rear, and on the flanks was cut to ribbons. So that from 18,000 men, not more than 2,000 got away. The enemy took possession of the camp. 22. When news of these successive defeats reached Rome, deep anxiety and alarm did indeed seize the community, but because supreme conduct of the war lay with the consuls, and to that point they had been successful, the defeats excited less emotion than they might have otherwise. Gaius Latorius and Marcus Metilius were sent as envoys to the consuls. They were to instruct them to gather carefully together what remained of the two armies, and see that fear and despair did not lead the men to surrender to the enemy, as had happened after the debacle at Cannae. The consuls were also ordered to hunt down deserters from the army of slave volunteers. The same assignment was given to Publius Cornelius, who also had a responsibility of raising fresh troops. Cornelius made a proclamation throughout the country towns and administrative centres that the slave volunteers should be hunted down and brought back into service. All these instructions were attentively carried out. The consul Appius Claudius put Decimus Junius in command at the mouth of Volturnus, and Marcus Aurelius Cotta at Puteoli. These were to dispatch grain to the camp, and the moment ships arrived from Etruria and Sardinia, Claudius himself returned to Capua, where he found his colleague Quintus Fulvius in the process of transporting everything from Casilinum and actively preparing for the blockade of Capua. The two then proceeded with the investment of the city, and they also called to their assistance the praetor Claudius Nero from the Castra Claudiana at Susula. Claudius left a small garrison at Susula to hold the position, and came down to Capua with the rest of his troops. Thus 3 generals' headquarters were set up around Capua, and 3 armies got down to work at different points, making ready to invest the city with a ditch and a rampart, and erecting fortresses at fairly narrow intervals. At the same time, they clashed at many points with the Capuans, who were trying to block the siege operations, and did so with such success that eventually the townspeople kept within their gates and fortifications. Before these different works could be joined up, however, spokesmen were sent to Hannibal to protest against his abandonment of Capua, which they said had been practically returned to the Romans, and to appeal to him to finally bring assistance, now that they were not just under siege, but actually surrounded by entrenchments. The consuls also received written orders from the praetor Publius Cornelius to permit any of the Capuans who so wished to leave, and take with them all their possessions before they completely cut out the city with their siege works. Those leaving before the 15th of March would remain free and retain possession of all their property, but any leaving after that date or remaining in the town would be counted as enemies. This offer was communicated to the Capuans, who treated it with such contempt as to respond with insults and threats. Hannibal had brought his legions to Tarentum from Herdonia, hoping to take the citadel of Tarentum, either by force or through intrigue. When that met with little success, he turned instead towards Brundisium, expecting that town to be betrayed to him. Here, too, he found that he was simply wasting his time, and it was at this point that the Capuan spokesmen reached him with their protests and appeals. Hannibal had a boastful reply for them. He had raised their siege before, he said, and on this occasion, too, the consuls would not withstand him when he arrived. Such were the hopes with which the spokesmen were sent off, and they were barely able to get back to Capua, which was now surrounded with a double trench and a double rampart.